Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to interrupt your conversations to welcome you here this morning. It's lovely to have you here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jo McConnell. I'm part of the team in this place, the staff team. And just a few housekeeping notices as we start. If you haven't already found the little girls' room and the little boys' room, if you head out of the auditorium, should you need them, turn left through the foyer and the bathrooms are down the hall by the kitchen. In the very, 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 very unlikely event of a fire, especially in the weather today, should the alarms go, the evacuation point is the magnolia tree in the car park. If you don't know what a magnolia tree looks like, don't worry, neither did I. It's the only tree in the car park, quite easy to find. And in your packs you had pencils. If you do, if that is the only thing you're writing with and you do need to sharpen, there is a couple of pencil sharpeners down the back of the room, should you need those too. Other than that, we'll have a couple of breaks as we go along. There'll be tea, coffee, and Terry's in the kitchen cooking up some scones. So I do believe you'll also have scones for morning tea. And that's really it from me. It's my pleasure to hand over to both a friend and a mentor of mine, Ironside. So here we go.
Oh, good morning, everybody. It's going to be a conversation today, more than a monologue, so we'll try that again. Good morning, everybody. Good. Is anybody else tired this morning from the storm? Is it just me? Dogs barked, house shook, and that was just me snoring. So, yeah. Feeling a little bit tired this morning, I confess, but we'll have a good time this morning and cover some good material. For those who don't know me, some of you do, I'm here very much with my hat on as a counsellor. For the last 8 years, really, I've been working in private practice, putting my Masters in psychology to good use, and as Jo mentioned, part of that is providing supervision for those particularly who are in caring roles. So sometimes I have chaplains and pastors and other counsellors, and those who work with people come and chat to me so that we can make sure that they can do that for a long time and to do it well, sustainably, which is the goal, because caring for people is tiring work. Who's in a caring job who's here today? So you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. The rest of you are thinking, yeah, I don't care. Yeah, that's good. So we are going to try and do this, a kind of workshop style, which means a couple of things. Yes, I'm going to talk a lot. So thank goodness after 25 years in radio, I have quite a nice voice to listen to, but on a Saturday morning it could be rather soothing and sleepy, so try and stay with me. And I will ask you to talk to each other. So in a moment I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to somebody beside you. You might already know the person beside you, but if you don't, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. And I'm going to invite you that during the course of today, let's make this a conversation. There are notes and there's content that we want to cover today. But if you have a question or if something didn't make sense or you'd like to push back and say, I'm not sure I even agree with that, feel free. It's important that this be dialogue as well as a monologue so that we really scratch where you're itching. And isn't it great that this is being funded by a third party? It's nice to be able to come together and not have cost be a barrier. So there are 3 more seminars in this series. Each of them is standalone, but like most things, when you put them all together, they'll also make some sense as well. So please, if you enjoyed today, please bring friends. And if you don't, please don't tell people you didn't enjoy today. Let's just leave that a secret between you and me. Right. So, chance to turn and meet the person next to you. And here is the question. I'm going to give you a minute or so to talk to each other. The question is, how will today have been worth coming to? How will you know that today was worth attending? All right, so turn to the person next to you, and if you're by yourself, you might have to turn around backwards and ask the question, how will you know that today was worth attending? let's come back, shall we? So some of us have had a chance to meet somebody. All right, so anybody want to share some of the answers about how we'll know that today was worthwhile?
There's two parts of it, for ourselves, but also helping other people.
Right.
Yeah.
And what for yourself would make it helpful? How would it be a good day?
Coping with all the stresses and strains of life.
Okay, so learning to cope with some stress. Sure, great. Who else has got an answer? How are we going to know today has been a success? Three important points. That's what you're hoping for. In 3 hours, let's hope you got 3. All right. Anybody else? Yeah.
I learned about that the diverse strategies, what may work on yourself may not work on the other person, so diverse strategies
Okay.
would be a good way.
All right, so hoping to hear more than one answer, more than one size fits all. Good, I can promise you that. We'll definitely do more than one answer. Anybody else?
And here, experience knows.
Okay. To experience God's peace. That's good. Yeah. For those of us who have a faith, and many of us in this room will have a faith, will find that this stuff will also make sense when we pair it up with our spirituality. But that's not going to be a requirement today, so don't freak out if you're thinking that isn't me. It's going to make sense either way. But it will make some extra sense for those for whom pursuing faith is part of their story, which will be many people in this room, I'm sure. All right, shall we get underway? So, living on the edge. Why do we call it living on the edge? One of the interesting things that I have learnt now over 3,000 hours of counselling work is that a lot of people seem to be doing exactly that, living on edge, on the edge. Not living in a place of security, not living in a place of peace, not living in a place of predictability, but in a world that seems unsafe. And sometimes they feel unsafe in that world. And it turns out that we're going to discover today that at the heart of that experience is something that we need to learn more about. I want to be really clear though, and I'll say this many times today, the window that we're going to look through today is only one way of looking at the issues that we're talking about. Not suggesting it's the only thing that's happening, not suggesting it's the only problem, but it is one window, a really important window. And in my work with people, I have found that if we don't start looking through that window, then we might miss something critical, and we might find that people are not able to respond to our efforts to help them, or that we are not able to really get on top of these issues. So we're going to cover a few big issues today. We're going to cover anger, we're going to cover anxiety, depression, stress, and finally childhood trauma. And learn how those things may all find their home in a very similar experience. So let's find out what we're talking about. We're going to use some videos today, you'll be happy to hear that. And we're going to use some technical stuff. This is about as technical as it's going to get. But this is going to be really important. Turns out, us human beings actually have 2 bodies coexisting inside one vessel. 2 autonomic nervous systems. That word autonomic is going to be really important today. And I mean this by the word autonomic. It has a mind of its own. It isn't under conscious control. It thinks it's in charge. And for the most part, in a good way, it really is. And we're glad that we don't have to think about things like breathing. We're glad that our body knows to do that. You don't have to think about every breath. Your body knows to keep doing it. So, these 2 bodies of yours. The one that's causing us the trouble, the one that means that we live on the edge, is this sympathetic nervous system. And that's what we're going to talk about quite a bit today, is what happens if this particular nervous system is on too often, and what happens when it switches on? And how does that ruin our day, and possibly if it stays on, ruin our life? And why is it that those things that we're grappling with, anger, anxiety, depression, stress, why are they related to this sympathetic nervous system. Now, hopefully, you arrived this morning in the other nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. So there are these two nervous systems in our body. And it turns out that really only one of them can be on at a time, or perhaps more accurately, we can say only one of them can be dominant at a time. It's really important now for us to realise that for many of us, these problems we're going to talk about today could just be talked about as being in the wrong body. That's a phrase we use a lot today. Being in the wrong body. What happens if we are spending life in this sympathetic body instead of the parasympathetic? So, let's watch a brief video to come to grips a bit more with what these two systems are really about. All right. Oh, sound?
About the sympathetic and parasympathetic aspects of the autonomic nervous system. Now, you may or may not know, the sympathetic nervous system gets its name because of the Greek sym meaning with and pathos meaning feelings. So it's where we also get the word sympathy from. So the sympathetic nervous system gives you these very powerful feelings, these feelings associated with fight or flight responses, the racing heart, the knots in the stomach, strong feelings of anger and fear. Your sympathetic nervous system, really one of its main roles is to mobilize you for action. It's mobility, it mobilizes you for fight or flight responses in the presence of threat. The fight responses gives rise to these very strong feelings of anger, frustration, and so forth, and all the relatives of anger, and the flight responses give rise to kind of fear and anxiety and all the various relatives of fear. The parasympathetic nerve, para means against, and so gets its name because the parasympathetic nervous system tends to kind of relax you. It puts you into chill-out mode. Parasympathetic nervous system is often characterized as rest and digest, feed and breed. So it helps you rest and recuperate, relax and chill out. It helps you to digest your food and absorb all the nutrients from your food and metabolize well. Feed and breed. The parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for all your sexual responses and having good sex and loving and cuddling and all this kind of stuff. It's very complex, the interaction between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. I'm really kind of simplifying here, but certainly for our intents and purposes, it's useful to just kind of think about sympathetic is really these nerves come out of the thoracic spine, go to various areas in the body, they activate our muscles, the fight or flight response, they speed up our heart rate, they get our circulation going, they increase our alertness and awareness, and of course they cause a release of adrenaline. So the sympathetic is responsible for mobilization, fight, flight response. The parasympathetic, rest, digest, feed and breed, relaxing, chilling out. The most salient feature of the parasympathetic nervous system is the vagus nerve, this huge whopping great nerve. The vagus nerve is the second largest nerve in the whole body, second only to the spinal cord itself. It's called the vagus nerve because vagus is Latin for wandering. The nerve wanders, it comes out of the brainstem and it wanders all around your kind of chest, your heart, your lungs, and down into the organs below the diaphragm. So we're going to have a look at the interplay of these in a bit more depth through the next few videos, but just keep that in your mind for now. The sympathetic is about mobilization, getting active fight or flight responses in the presence of threat, and parasympathetic is about immobilization. It's about slowing down. Feed, breathe, rest and digest.
All right, so there you go. So that's just a little bit of a summary there of those two systems. Don't worry, this is as technical as it's going to get. Once we're finished with the technical stuff, relax, it won't be so medical in nature. So sympathetic, it's actually 3 F's. It's fight, flight, what's the third F? Freeze. Actually, there is actually a 4th F. No, not that one. What's the 4th F? Function. So some people function. So when you think of Willie Apiata, under fire, rescues his comrades. He's definitely in his sympathetic, but he's functioning. But for most of us, we don't function. For most of us, it's an overwhelming experience that will fall into those first three Fs. Fight, flight, or freeze. Fight, I want to defeat the enemy. Flight, I want to run from the enemy. And freeze, maybe I could hide from the enemy. Okay? And it's this response that is often behind the things we're going to talk about today. That when we're in that body, everything suddenly gets funneled into one thing. It's a threat, and I'm focused, and I must do something about it. And many of us will have a kind of a dominant response to that. We'll have a favourite one. I'm definitely flight. I'm a lover, not a fighter. I don't want to have an argument. I don't want to get into fisticuffs. I just want to run away. I just want to get the hell out of here when the trouble strikes. Why don't you turn to the person next to you and tell them which of the three Fs would be your dominant one? What do you do most often? Fight, flight, or freeze? All right, let's come back. So most of us found that relatively easy, right, to work out what we do. We have a dominant, although I spoke to someone recently who, when I went through the fight, the flight, the freeze, basically told the story about how he would often begin in fight, transition to flight, and then ultimately feel overwhelmed and not be able to do it anymore and shut down. And so for him, all three were present, but the first one, the go-to one, was anger. But in his case, angry words, not necessarily angry actions, but of course anger is kind of scary to be around, even if it is only angry words, right? So fight, flight, freeze. What if we're in the wrong body and we are now acting on autopilot towards a threat out of one of those responses? And so the challenge, of course, becomes that once our body decides to switch on this alarm and adopt this response, whatever you and I are dealing with in that moment will get reclassified as a threat. Now, when we're in relationships with others, of course, they're not necessarily seeing those things as a threat. So we are perceived as overreacting, particularly if we get really angry. But if we're doing freeze, we might look like we're suddenly underreacting, shutting right down, unable to cope. But both are exaggerated responses because this sympathetic response is all about a threat. And the only thing the brain can focus on in that moment is the threat. So we've added freeze to fight and flight from the video. On the other side, I want to add something to the parasympathetic. So this parasympathetic, as the video is talking about, is about eating and digestion. It's about rest and sleep. And here's the third one I want to add to it. It's about creativity and problem solving. And we could put it this way, that when the sympathetic is on, the parasympathetic functions are offline. Which is why trying to solve problems, have discussions when we're in this sympathetic state, means that we often don't have a good sense of what the way forward is. We have real trouble thinking clearly, strategizing. And so it's often the next morning when our body is relaxed again and we're back in the parasympathetic and the creativity and problem solving is back online that we'll suddenly see it in a different way. Oh, that's what I need to do. Oh, that's what was happening for me. But in the moment, of course, when the sympathetic is on, we can't see anything. And so we're going to learn today that when we're in the sympathetic, we need to suspend problem-solving activities. We need to suspend trying to have great insight about what's going on. And I can say as a counsellor, this has been a huge learning for me. I've realised that so often I'm trying to help someone, and I'm thinking to myself, what's wrong with them? My advice is awesome. I have cracked the case. I am Sherlock Holmes. I have gotten to the bottom of your problems. The least you could do is change. And I've realised that they're in their sympathetic. They cannot hear my problem solving. They cannot hear it. It's like, and I have learnt now, I have to work out which body are they in, because they won't be able to hear me if they're in the wrong body. And a lot of conversations that you and I regret are conversations had in that wrong body. A lot of the moments we wish we could go back and do over. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that most, if not all, of the regretful things that you and I have said and done were done in the wrong body. Anybody else have the experience when they're in that body that they feel out of control? They feel like it's so big, it's so, well, of course, it's having to inflate everything into life or death. You know, if you're swimming at Piha and you see a fin in the water, you do not think to yourself, I wonder what breed of shark that is. You don't try and solve a problem, you get the hell out of there. All right? So we are singularly focused when the threat really is present. But in real life, of course, the problem for the brain is this. It doesn't have a second area for emotional threats. Your brain is only as big as your fists. It doesn't have a second area for emotional threats. So it has to activate the same physical threat response for emotional threats. But that response proves to be too big. So, just so we're absolutely clear, sometimes we'll have to work out which body we're in by reverse engineering. So we want to get really clear on what's happening in our body when that system is on. And I'm going to ask you to talk to the person next to you again in a second, but first of all, I want you to just think for a minute, when was a recent time I was in that body? And if I just froze myself for a second and checked in and scanned my body, what would have been the symptoms? Now, I can tell you my symptoms are really easy for me to identify. There's usually three things that'll tip me off that I've been tripped. I get a knot in my stomach really fast. The saliva in my mouth disappears. It's like the Sahara in there. It's suddenly cotton mouth, you know, like no saliva. And this fogginess suddenly comes across my brain. And I'm just sort of aware that I feel like I'm kind of being dropped to the bottom of a swimming pool. And things have gotten a bit sort of weird and slow. Right? So if I scan my body, that's what's happening when I'm in that mode. I want you to talk to the person next to you about when you scan your body, if you got tripped but you didn't know it had happened, and you're only trying to work it out by what was happening in your body, what would you use as the guide? So to the person next to you, you can use that list there to kind of get you going in terms of, heart beating faster, whatever it might be, clenching of muscles, what's happening in your body. So turn to the person next to you and tell them what it's like when you're in your sympathetic. So we might have to use our body to reverse engineer, I'm in the wrong body. And the reason for that is that our brain does this thing called appraisal. The brain loves to deal in shortcuts. Because it's such a small organ, it does shortcuts all the time to save energy, processing energy. You and I, probably most of us this morning, were quite happy that our brain does this shortcut about how to drive. Right? We don't have to think about it, our brain does it. Sadly, my brain was in such automated mode this morning that I missed the turn-off and had to drive all the way to Drury and come back. So it was I was in shortcut mode, you know. The problem is that this emotional shortcut happens too quickly. It's this thing called appraisal. So appraisal, and this is going to be really important in terms of us thinking about our story, appraisal is our brain asking this question: is there anything about what's happening right now that reminds me of something that's happened before? And if it concludes the answer is yes, it reaches into the emotional part of our brain called the limbic system, and it brings up that feeling. And if that feeling is a fight, flight, freeze feeling, it will set off the alarm as it goes. Appraisal takes 1/10 of a second. Which means you're in a conversation with someone and they just have a tone in their voice. And your brain remembers that Mum used to have that tone, and it meant I was in trouble. And in 1/10 of a second, I feel like a little boy in trouble, ready to defend myself against the big person hurting me, or something. In 1/10 of a second. Now, the challenge for you and I will often mean that because it happens in 1/10 of a second, we think our body is responding to what's happening in front of us, but it might actually be responding to some other event from another time because it's done this shortcut. In other words, it said to itself, I don't need to work out if this is Mum and if I'm really in trouble. That tone of voice is all the information I need. And suddenly our brain forgets important information like, I'm not little anymore, and that's not my mum. And I don't have to set off the alarm to cope with this. And that all happens in 1/10 of a second. So we want to use our body as our first kind of scanning tool to keep asking this question, am I in the right body? Which body am I in right now? Has the alarm gone off and I wasn't looking? And for many of us, if the alarm goes off a lot, we're not very conscious. It just feels like life. It just feels like what happens, right? So, we're going to take a break in a few moments. We've got 5 topics to cover. And then, hopefully, the 6th topic will be what to do about it all. So, we're going to talk about anger. Now we realise that whilst there are definitely moments in life that anger seems to be an appropriate response, we can certainly see now that often anger is a shortcut that our brain has reached for because the alarm has gone off. And we want to start thinking about, what if my anger isn't proof that some great injustice has just befallen me, but proof that I've been triggered into this response. But since we're talking about a serious thing, how about something not so serious? Just a reminder that even animals can be angry.
Are you happy to see me?
Okay. So, ancient wisdom, of course, has reminded us that anger often leads to bad behaviour. The things that are said in anger are often the things we regret in the morning. So, of course, as the Bible has exhorted people for generations, in your anger, do not sin and don't let the sun go down while you are still angry. Stay up and fight. No, that's not how that goes. But it is true, right? Anger has never made anything better. Anger has never helped other people feel more loved. Never in your life have you heard this phrase, well, thank you for ripping me a new one. It's just what I needed. I really needed someone to tell me just how lousy I am. Yeah, no, anger has never made anything better. And it gets us in an out-of-control kind of place. So we want to avoid letting the anger rule the roost. And of course, we just recognise that it's not part of helpful living. One of the things that's interesting actually on that note about in your anger do not sin, the anger is not the problem there, is it? It's the behaviour that follows that could be the problem. Here's something for those of us who are living with angry people that I would really love for you to know. The things said in anger are not what the person really believes. That seems to be something that many of us who live with an angry person tend to think. Well, now we know what you finally believe. You finally got angry and you told me what you really think. No, actually, that's almost never the case. It's usually the case that I say in anger what I think will help defeat the threat. And so I might use a kind of aggression and the sorts of words I would never otherwise use, not because that's genuinely what I think, but because I know that you will cower if I say it. So, causes of anger. I'll take a minute with the person next to you and let's answer this question. What was the last thing that made you angry? The last thing that really made you angry, what had happened? Right, go and talk to someone. All right, let's come back, shall we? I'm not going to ask you to share your story, but suffice to say that often it will fall in a few categories, won't it? Mostly it will fall in the category of some kind of frustrated goal. Something that I hope would happen that isn't happening. Well, let me put that to you this way. Again, at the risk of oversimplifying, but sometimes it's just memorable, and that sometimes anger is disappointment energy turned outward. A frustrated goal. Yeah. Sometimes anger is disappointment energy turned outward. Or to put it another way, I'm feeling disappointed about the way things are and I don't know what to do about it, so maybe you know what to do about it. And so maybe I'll pass you the disappointment. Maybe you'll do better at handling the disappointment than I'm doing. Because I don't know what to do with this, and maybe you do. But of course, it's not handing it to the other person nicely, is it? And nor is it their problem, ultimately, that you're disappointed. But oftentimes, it's disappointment energy turned outward. I'm not coping with what's disappointing, so I'm going to make this your problem. Because maybe if it's your problem, I won't have to deal with it. Yeah.
Well, I think what you tend to be, because then is the first emotion that's at the top, and it's the easiest one to choose. If you
Sure.
choose anger, you don't work through the 7 stages to get to where the problem is. And anger is always at the top. So it's quite an easy success.
I agree that it's easy. Here's the thing I'm going to disagree with. Choosing.
That's right.
Nobody chooses to feel this way. This is an autonomic response. The body has chosen this. We've not chosen it. We've not thought, of all the things I'd like to do right now, I know, I'm going to be really angry. No, the anger has come like a torrent of feeling, uncontrollable with a mind of its own. And it's really important that we get our head around that. These autonomic responses are not chosen responses. It chose us. Now, yes, we have choices. Not denying that we don't have choices. How long we're going to let that anger last for, what we say, what we do, is still we have some choices. But the very presence of the anger in a tenth of a second your limbic system has turned on the alarm. It's a threat present. And you're right, for many people, that's right at the top. Particularly for men, of course, it's often been observed that men will funnel a lot of feelings and they come out as anger at the bottom. But it's really important that we understand that ultimately what's happening, and I think this is the huge kind of change along the idea of anger being disappointment, energy turned outward, is simply this. That angry people are afraid. They're afraid. Because the threat response is on. So they're feeling afraid. And they've decided their best shot at dealing with being afraid is to defeat, or their body believes, defeat the threat. So why not try and defeat it, see if we can make it go away. And I wonder what difference it would make when confronted with an angry person, rather than thinking, well, you're just being unreasonable and I just don't like being talked to like this, to be thinking, actually, this person seems really afraid. And they're so afraid that they've puffed out their chest, they've increased the volume of their voice, because what they really want is for you not to know how afraid I am. So if I look strong, maybe you'll back down. If I look powerful, maybe you won't see that I'm feeling afraid. And it's to realize that oftentimes, again, none of these things are always, but often the angry person is just afraid. And if you're in the wrong body, this sympathetic body, we want to remember, hold on, how would I respond if my first thought was they were afraid? Because I might have a different reaction to them. If in my brain I could just tell myself, slow down, they're trying to draw me into this response, what if I just thought, no, maybe they're just afraid. They're just scared right now. And what if I was able to ask myself, because of course remember, their problem-solving brain is offline right now, I wonder what they're afraid of. I wonder what their brain has told them is happening right now. I wonder. You see, if we could just pause as the recipients of anger for a moment and just do those little steps, sometimes we might come up with something that we realise might be happening for them. We could ask them. But at the very least, that we could acknowledge, wow, you're feeling really uptight right now, aren't you? You're feeling really frustrated. But unfortunately, most of us would like to make the anger go away, so we might rise to meet them. Well, if you think you're angry, you should see what I can do. We tear off our shirt and reveal the superhero costume below and say, well, I can match your anger with anger, buddy. Right? And now we've got two angry people. And nobody's in their parasympathetic, everybody's in their sympathetic body. We're in the wrong body. And to finish this section, and then we'll have a cup of tea, is to remind ourselves that anger doesn't produce right action. Anger is never going to bring out the part of us that we were glad. Anger is never going to help other people feel that we love them. So the presence of the anger, in a sense, that comes so fast that we won't be able to stop that. But what happens next? And we're going to work out today what to do when it strikes. So that we don't keep making angry choices, as has been rightly pointed out. But it's so painful once we start choosing to follow the anger and to let it be in charge. But I understand at the end of that anger, it's probably not something that we're glad to say or to do. When I was training as a counsellor, I went to a course called Living Wisdom, and the teacher of that course, David Riddell, made this incredible challenge. He said, what would it be like to live in an anger-free home? What would it be like? And for many of us, it doesn't seem that that could be possible to live in an anger-free home. But it's a great starting point, isn't it, to say, you know what? Since anger is never going to help us get to where we need to go, it's never going to be a welcome visitor. So yeah, it might not be possible to stop anger ever showing up, but we can certainly learn to not open the door and invite anger in and say, come, stay a while, tear the place up. But maybe, and this is what we'll learn today, maybe, particularly those of us who are in relationships with others, if we could learn to help each other stay in our parasympathetic body, then anger wouldn't appear very often at all. So, let's take a break for the next 15 minutes or so. There's tea and coffee and bathrooms, have a chance to stretch your legs, and we'll come back at, let's say, 10 past 10. The two which I will relay and then try and answer. And the question was, if I'm sort of angry a lot or bitter about the past, is it still true that I'm in the wrong body? Is it the same issue? And it's certainly true that we want to be clear that each situation needs to be explored, but there's every chance the answer is still yes. And I want to explain to you why. This could be a really important thing for you to understand about how your brain works. So I want you to make a fist, two fists in front of you with your thumbs on the inside rather than the outside. So thumb on the inside. We'd never make a fist like this in real life. Thumb on the inside. There you go. All right, so you got two fists in front of you. That's your brain. That's actually about the size of your brain. So turn to the person next to you and see if your brain is bigger than theirs. Statistically speaking, I'm sorry ladies, but men's brains are slightly larger statistically, but that's mostly because we have to keep our ego in there. So, you don't need as big a space. All right, so the outside of the fist, I'm being very simplistic for the sake of today. The outside is the cortex or neocortex, the thinking part of your brain. Where the thumb is the limbic system. Everybody say limbic system. Limbic system with a B, limbic system. The main structure of the limbic system is a little structure called the amygdala. Now the amygdala is a Greek word. Who likes languages? I like languages. Amygdala is the Greek word for almond. So this structure, the size and shape of an almond, is causing a whole bunch of trouble because the amygdala is the emotional center as part of the limbic system, the emotional part of your brain. Now here's the thing. When you were in mummy's tummy, your limbic system was the first structure to grow in your brain. So before you had any idea about this thing called time, your brain was recording feelings about mainly safety, how safe you were and how you were feeling. So before you had words and concepts of time, you started recording about feelings. So here's the problem. It means the limbic system doesn't know about time, which means it does this little thing called time travel, often. And would you believe that the same part of your brain that does remembering does imagining? So our brain can really do some time travel trick. And when we are bitter, one of the things that might be happening is our brain is reaching into the limbic system and remembering an offense from another time, and is getting confused about what's happening right now. So we talked about how sometimes our brain gets tricked. Here's a tone of voice and remembers somebody else who uses that tone of voice. That's happening in response to something in the moment, right? I've heard a tone of voice and I've gotten confused. But I don't even need the other person to get confused, because if I keep repeating and remembering a painful story, my brain gets tricked and brings up the feeling again that belongs to that painful story, as if that's happening right now. Your limbic system is listening to you the whole time. So you have to be really careful that you don't trick it by retelling a painful story from the past, because it's hearing that it's happening. Or, because it does remember, the same part of your brain that is remembering, does imagining, you're starting to imagine some future calamity. This was a challenge in COVID, wasn't it? Am I going to lose my job? Is everything going to be okay? And our brain hears us talking about this future catastrophe and believes it's happening right now, and sets off the alarm. So we have to be really careful with our limbic system. So that is one of the problems with bitterness. We could say bitterness is practicing going back and confusing the limbic system. rather than saying to ourselves, that painful thing happened back there, but it isn't what's happening up here in present day life. If we don't tell the limbic system about time, it just assumes that the fact that we're thinking about it or talking about it means it's happening here. Right, any other questions on anger before we continue? Yeah.
Can you maybe give a little bit of insight about passive aggressive?
Passive aggressive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reactions, like how does that work?
Yeah, well, I mean, passive aggressive again is probably where disposition and anger collide, right? So, if I'm have a history of violence and angry actions in my life, I might just lean on those. I might smash plates. I might hurt people. But if I don't, if perhaps I'm angry, but I'm of a different kind of style of person, I might express that anger in more passive ways. Sure, but that's why it's called passive aggression, right? There's still this wrong body present, but it is trying to be angry without kind of being seen to be a certain way. So sometimes that's just a style issue. I certainly know I'm probably more prone to passive aggressive. The comment, the cutting comment. Yeah.
Just going back to the living past, thank you so much. One thing that comes to me is my husband's part.
Yes. Absolutely. And as I say, that's why the mirror for looking behind you is much smaller than the window for looking ahead. Because looking behind doesn't have information that we need. But our brain thinks it does until we teach it otherwise. So we've got to be really careful. Right, one more question on anger before we continue. Anybody? Yeah. Certainly anger acting out never helped, but I'm not entirely sure how being angry ever helped either.
What if it's like a signal that boundaries are being crossed, boundaries aren't very healthy? So emotions are signals for something not being quite right. What about anger as a signal?
Okay. And so again, we've got this challenge of anger in the way we're talking about anger today, which is a sympathetic response, is too big for the moment. So yeah, if somebody contravenes my boundary, well yes, I'll need to do something, but anger isn't the something that's needed. I might simply need to restate my boundary. Remind them that actually no means no. I don't need to say, I said no! That isn't what is needed. I just need to restate it. So you're right that action's required, but assertive action would do. Anger is an overreach. It's too big for the moment. And it means that we might then see it in ways that looks unhelpful. Because now we're reacting if something really dangerous is occurring, but actually a little bit of assertiveness could have done the trick. True? Yeah. Yep. That's
I'm probably confusing the definition of this anger is talking about. I confess I'm one of those, I'm a fighter, so I use my anger about injustice to give me the courage to fight that injustice for myself or somebody else, or for systematic injustice, whatever.
Yeah.
So it's not that I make about, but I'm just about, because I am actually a wrong person because I'm losing my hearing. So that anger is not, I'm not talking about my reaction, I'm talking about the source of my courage to fight something that is wrong. I think there's a bit of a problem here, saying what is this anger we're talking about? Because the anger is the feeling, isn't it? And the energy source, it's not what comes out on the other end.
Well, I think it's about that.
Yeah, but then we have to keep finding it.
Well, again, we need to ask ourselves, why must I be angry to fight injustice? Why not just do the right thing because I realise a wrong thing is happening? What role does the anger genuinely play? And it might not be helpful. Well, here's the reason why I would push back on, is to say that if we indulge anger, remember what part of our brain we're switching off? Problem solving and creativity. Well, aren't I going to need that to defeat injustice? So I'm actually going to need to try and keep that sympathetic response as suppressed as possible. So perhaps you could say it like this: I notice injustice and even my body reacts to it, which is a signal that I should do something. But before I decide what that something is, I better check, is there anything life-threatening happening? Because if there isn't, then this response isn't what needs to be in charge. But it may well have signaled to me that something needs to happen now, but genuine assertiveness probably again would do the trick.
You did mention the fourth F, function, or
Sure.
functionality, or something
Function.
like that. It shows that there are.
Well, it's possible, but we're just going to be clear, have I got my problem-solving brain on or not? How many of us can remember either being the one or being on the receiving end of a moment where this phrase applies, that the lesson got lost in the lecture? So when the anger is present, the lesson gets lost.
Yeah.
Because the other person ends up paying more attention to the tone than to the message. I had a long time to learn this with my kids. I have young adult children, and each of them at one stage or another has said this to me: "Stop yelling at me." And I'd be thinking, I'm not yelling. I'm speaking in conversational volume. I'm trying to offer this incredibly rational response. It took a long time to realise, oh, yelling is a tone, not a volume. Because I was thinking, if you think that was yelling, you should see what I'm capable of with this big voice. But yelling is a tone. And as soon as the tone was present, my children were responding to the tone and not to the content. So let's move on. We have a lot to cover today. Next topic is anxiety. So we've done fight. Now it's time to think about flight. And again, I'm glad, as someone who has a relationship with God, that God seems to be more than aware of how human beings are made. It's not true, by the way, if you've ever heard it said in church that there were 365 fear nots in the Bible, one for every day of the year. You might have heard that. It's not true. There are about 70 fear nots, and that's plenty. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. So again, we find even God is saying, hey, your anxiety is not going to bring out the kind of response to situations that you need. The fight or flight is not actually going to help you. So I want to play you a story of someone experiencing anxiety. I will warn you that there is at least one bad word in this, so young people, close your ears or try not to smile when you hear it.
From the outside, it's easy to think that somebody's got it all figured out. Because my hair is curled and my cheeks aren't intentionally flushed, I must not have a care in the world. As if it were expected for my demons to be worn like a scarlet letter pinned to my chest. And they assume if you cannot see it, then it's not really there. As if pain does not exist unless you're bleeding or slung in a cast or staggering with a limp. But sometimes the most painful demons are the ones they can't even see. So we learn how to smile, how to grin and bear it, because nobody likes to talk about the tough stuff. Hell, I don't like to talk about the tough stuff. I have anxiety. It feels like every cell in my body is moving so fast that my veins are blurry. That despite the constant metronome of my heartbeat inside my ears, it's like listening to spastic drumline. It feels like the unease in my ears, like a broken white noise machine playing all of the sounds at once. And I don't even realize I'm gritting my teeth or cracking my knuckles or rubbing my forefinger against my pinky or twisting the gold band on my middle finger, holding onto myself like I'm the only lifeline bridging the gap between reality on my own 2 feet and the atomically loud abyss of noises and sounds and feelings of fleeting rushing through my veins. And I'm avoiding eye contact. Not because I'm not listening to what you're saying, because I'm listening to the sound of my own voice, hoping that through your ears you can't hear that it's 2 octaves too high and on the verge of breaking because my palms are sweating and I somehow forgot to speak with anything behind my words other than insecurity. My anxiety feels like fire. Unexplainably hot and rash and frustrating as I gnaw the inside of my cheek as if the solution to this feeling is buried between my teeth and gums. It feels like drowning, but it feels like burning. I imagine my feet moving with trails of dust behind them like those cartoons because somehow it feels like I'm moving faster than the 60 seconds they've allowed in a minute. All the while, I'm just playing catch up on the stopwatch. And it doesn't add up like it did in high school mathematics. I can't carry the 1 and find the square root of the problem because most of the time, there is no problem. There's no life or death situation, there's no rhyme or reason, there's just feelings, and I'm feeling all of them at once. Some days are better than others. Some days are worse. But they're just days. And I've got more where they came from.
So that was a pretty good description, wasn't it? A couple of my children sadly deal with anxiety, and one of the descriptions that one of them has used was that dad talking to other people when you're feeling anxious is like trying to talk to someone while holding an electric fence. That is a very powerful image. So you and I don't often see what's happening for other people, but it's often the case, if they're in the wrong body, that the anxiety is now coming and causing all kinds of symptoms, many of which were mentioned in the video. And again, this is why we use our body as a way of scanning for information. In case we don't realize that when we weren't looking, the alarm was set off. And now our body is responding as if something terrible is happening. It's not actually happening. As she said, there is no actual threats. And here's the problem with the way the brain works. Anything you repeat, you will automate. If you can play an instrument, it's because you repeated and repeated until one day it was automated. And you could do it without thinking about it. And the same is true for feelings. Any feeling that is repeated, cultivated, practiced will in fact get automated. What counsellors call in this case an automatic negative thought, an act. An automatic negative thought. And so we're going to learn today that part of the answer is to stop feeding the ant. By indulging this idea that in fact there is something worthy of such a strong response. And it turns out, you see, that anxiety is a type of faith. But it's a faith in the negative. That faith in anything, be it positive or negative, produces results. Putting faith in fear generates destructive results, beginning with the disintegration of our ability to relate confidently to the external world. Faith and fear are very close. Fear is a belief, this deeply held belief that the bad thing is happening, as if it really is happening. Remembering now, our limbic system can't tell the difference between your imagined, projected, predicted danger and actual danger. It doesn't know the difference. You have to teach it what's really going on. So it's a kind of a faith. And so, it turns out, for many of us, But what there is a lot of alarm going off. But now the alarm has a mind of its own. And sometimes the alarm goes off simply because we haven't told our brain what we want. That at rest, it just decides, oh, nothing's happening. Bop, 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 bop. Let's turn the alarm on. Isn't that what you like? Don't we turn the alarm on often? And this faulty alarm is now present in our world. And sometimes it really does feel like an alarm, right? It is like that, bop, 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 in our ears. How do I make that stop? So anxiety is often, this alarm now has been so well practiced that we have a hair trigger, that it takes almost nothing to get it going. I have anxiety problems. Let me tell you about some situations where I learnt not to trust the trigger. For many years I worked in radio, and one day I got to the radio station and I opened up my computer, and all I saw was this headline in the subject line of an email. It said, urgent, it was in capitals. That's always dangerous, isn't it? Capitals are dangerous. It was written by a boomer. Anyway, it said, urgent, read this before you go on air today. The alarm has gone off. Adrenaline. I'm in trouble. Something bad is happening, right? I'm swimming in adrenaline. And I caught myself. Well, hold on. You only read the first line. You don't even know what the topic of the email is, and already your brain has decided to set off the alarm and to flood your body with adrenaline. So I go to the bathroom, splash some water on my face, take a few deep breaths and say, okay, why don't we wait and see what the email's about before we decide whether or not this is the appropriate response. So I opened the email and it said, there are 2 music festivals this summer. We are the official sponsor of one of them. Please mention the right one when you're on air today. Anything I needed to be anxious about? Not at all. But the alarm had gone off in 1/10 of a second because I saw the exclamation mark and I saw the bold, and it was from a boss, a big person. And even though I couldn't have imagined exactly what I might have been in trouble about, everything in me was convinced I was in trouble about something. But my brain didn't know. It responded too fast before it had access to the facts. We call this emotion-based reasoning, and anxious people often struggle with this, in that they ultimately believe, my feelings wouldn't lie to me. If this feeling is present, it must know something. I mean, I'll be honest with you, friends, as someone who suffers with anxiety, I thought I had a superpower. I thought I could anticipate danger better than most people, because I had this special capacity to see danger where nobody else could. And then set the alarm off, and then of course nothing dangerous would actually happen, which was proof that I was right to set the alarm off. It worked! That's emotion-based reasoning, where the emotion comes first, and then the story comes second. What is my story to justify my feeling? So I have to be really careful not to do emotion-based reasoning, and to actually catch myself, which came first here, the story or the feeling. Was I already feeling anxious before I started imagining my story? Because if I was, I need to stop. Because anxiety wants to justify its existence. The adrenaline wants to justify its presence in our body, so it concocts a story. And here's the thing, if it can't find something in the present moment, where might it look? The past or in the future? The old pen scratch. Right? And so we've got to be so careful not to buy into this belief. So if you're going to write down something about anxiety, write this. Anxiety doesn't know what the future holds, only what it's afraid of. Anxiety does not know what the future holds, only what it's afraid of. So the only option anxiety will have, if it can't find a threat in the present moment, is to say, well, this must be preemptive. The threat must be coming. And all it will do, it will take the thing that it's afraid of and it will put it in the future. But you and I don't know what the future holds. You and I don't have that superpower. Anybody in the room see COVID coming? We don't know what the future holds.
But when I see a couple of carbon money, I know what they're asking me.
Yeah, well, okay. Thanks for that. But for many of us, anxiety is a lower level experience, which many of us will call stress. And stress is a kind of daily anxiety that many of us have decided is just part of life. And many of us will even say things like, that course I'm doing is stressful. My job is stressful. My life is stressful. Sound familiar? It's almost a badge of honour, isn't it, to say how stressful things really are? So how about this thing? What if it turns out that stress doesn't actually exist? Stress doesn't actually exist. What exists is pressure. Pressure exists. Stress is a belief about the pressure. Stress is a belief that this pressure is too much for me to cope with. Stress is an interpretation. You see, if it was true that this job is stressful, then why isn't it stressful for everybody who does this job? Why was it not so stressful for the last person who did this job? You see, if stress was real, it would mean that everybody who does that course is going to get stressed, because after all, isn't the course stressful? And yet I notice that some of my fellow students are not stressed. Now the pressure is real. Everybody needs to do the exam. Everybody needs to do the assignment. Everybody needs to hit that deadline. The pressure is real. The stress is an interpretation. It's an interpretation that requires me to believe that I cannot cope. And what this does, for many of us, is it activates our sympathetic, because a little squirt of adrenaline feels like power, feels like strength, feels like I can do stuff. And some of us have found some ways to activate a little bit of adrenaline. Anybody want to suggest some tactics that people might use to activate a bit of adrenaline? Coffee. Yeah. I mean, lots of coffee-stimulated, stressed people. Gets me going. What else? Oh, procrastination. I will let the deadline get really close so that the alarm goes off. Ah, it's due in the morning. Ah, I'm up, I'm doing it. Right? I've got my superpower going. Ooh, yeah, baby. 3 a.m. and I'm... We've intentionally leaned into adrenaline. We might not have consciously done it. We do not realise what we're doing, but we're certainly intentional. Because it came with this idea that I couldn't do regular things without a superpower. And this is what becomes a problem for us. So we're going to see two problems this morning that are on either sides of this coin. On the one hand, we've got when we actually, in a sense, do stuff to get the adrenaline going, like we actually think the sympathetic would be the better body to be in. And then we're going to discover that sometimes life has dealt us some curveballs that mean we don't know how to turn the sympathetic off, which we're going to talk about later. But right now we're talking about the fact that what if it turns out that the only thing that is real is the pressure, and that stress only occurs when pressure exceeds resilience. You see, if I know I can do the assignment, and I know all I have to do is make a plan, read the books, make the notes, do a draft. My wife is studying this year, she's doing a part-time counselling, and I gave her a resilience strategy that has meant that even though she's studying for the first time in over 20 years, or closer to 30 years, she's getting good grades. And it was simply this: send a draft of your assignment to the lecturer. The lecturer's job is to help you pass. Now, someone who didn't know to do that tactic and had already had some papers in a similar topic failed the first assignment because they just... But what this meant was that Debbie knew that she could be resilient, that she could send in the draft, respond to the feedback, improve the assignment, and get a good grade. The pressure remained present, but now there was no stress because she had adopted a strategy that would cultivate resilience. As long as I get some feedback from the lecturer about what to improve, I can do that. I can strengthen the bits that need strengthening. Right? I'm not saying it's the only thing, I'm just saying as an example of when we bolster our resilience, when we increase our confidence that we could cope, suddenly the pressure is no longer stressful. It's still real, there's still stuff to do, not denying that, but stress requires us to interpret it in a certain way. So, stress is the body's reaction to the belief it doesn't have the resources to cope. And it's that harnessing of the superpower. So I want us to get rid of stress because we're practicing switching on our sympathetic. And I'm hoping that you've already worked out that that's not what we want to do. That we do not want to live in the wrong body. So we have developed certain habits and practices to get that going because we've come to believe that we need adrenaline to cope with real life. Because we've told ourselves the story, I don't have the resources. I'll need a superpower for that. And we use coffee, we use procrastination, whatever it is we use. So partly the problem, of course, is that stress is a faulty perspective. You might want to look at that photo for a little while to realise what's happening. Got it? All right. Okay. So what perspective problems will get the stress going? Well, the first two are kind of the sides of the same coin. When we try and control that which is out of our control, that will grow the stress response. Because if it is in fact out of our control, then our efforts will prove futile. If you're sitting in traffic screaming at it, oh my goodness sake, bring along people! Or what my daughter likes to call a red light is otherwise described as 3, 2, 1, come on! Because she knows that it'll take about 3 seconds before I say come on to somebody. I did laugh that when she finally got her restricted license and I drove with her, I heard her saying, oh, can't believe that guy didn't. And she's already doing what I do, and it's already, come on! Trying to control that which you can't control is going to grow the feeling of powerlessness. And that will mean our perception of stress will grow. Now similarly, if we give up too soon and we fail to control that which we can control, then of course we are not putting our best foot forward, and now the things we could do and could accomplish and could influence aren't happening. So that will also increase our stress. Hello. So it grows the feeling of powerlessness. It's all that's left, isn't it? Because I was never able to get that to happen. But stress will equally occur when we fail to control that which we can control. Also, stress occurs when we fail to focus on the sequence. Debs is an artist, and she wanted to do an art exhibition one time, and she came to me and she said, it's 3 weeks to this exhibition. I haven't completed a single piece of art. I'm feeling very stressed. In her mind, there was just one task. Create all the art for an art exhibition. I said, we need to talk about the sequence. We need to put some rungs in the ladder between here and the art exhibition. Just the sequence of things you could do to move towards that goal. So she started writing down these things, and they literally wrote a ladder, and she wrote things on each of the rungs. The first thing she did was arrange all of her paints by colour to see which paints might need to be purchased. The second thing she did was decide that she would do painting all of the canvases white, that had other things on them, and undercoating, that's the word I'm looking for, undercoating all of the canvases. By focusing on the sequence, within a couple of weeks she came back and said, I've done 18 pieces of art for this exhibition. By focusing more on the sequence and not letting the total end game cause the stress. Because you can't do a whole exhibition in one step. You can only do that next step. So there's things we can do to keep our stress under control. Stress occurs when we load up with meaning what is taking place. If I don't get a good grade, it means that I'm done. And if I'm done, it means I'll never get to work in that industry. And if I never get to work in that industry, my life will be meaningless. And if it is meaningless, then I am useless and of no value. And once we start playing the meaning, what we think it means, then the stress starts to grow. In other words, we have now pumped up this one activity with all these stakes. There's so much on the line. It's not just about getting a good grade on the assignment, it's now whether or not I'm a good human. That might be a bit much to work out from an assignment. We might not get that much information from your grade. Your lecturer doesn't write B+ person. Must try harder. It's only the assignment you're getting graded on, not your life. See, as soon as we have an additional meaning we need to be aware of. How am I making things more stressful? Remembering that the higher the stakes, the more the presence of a threat. You see, if I believe my very worth as a human is on the line, I can't afford to get a bad grade. And I'm going to activate the sympathetic response. It's a threat now instead of an assignment. What about when you simply stress about being stressed? Anybody else do that? Yeah. These are the kinds of emotional and cognitive loops that we get caught into simply because we have been practicing. Simply now because we remember that the last time I was stressed, I hated it. And so I don't want to be stressed because stress really sucks and I don't sleep at night and I feel tired all the time and I feel anxious and now I'm stressed about the idea of getting stressed. Right? So we've got to be careful about what we practice. And then finally, and this is such an important one, that stress occurs when your emotional resources are depleted. If you've not been taking good care of yourself, then your perceived resilience is low. If you know there isn't enough in the tank for that activity, there isn't enough in you to finish the assignment, that you are too tired, too empty, too drained, well, of course you're going to feel stressed. And you're going to feel like, well, then I'll need my superpower. Because my regular powers have run out. I want you to listen to this. Using adrenaline to cope with ordinary life is like driving your car with your foot on the accelerator the whole time. You are draining the tank quickly. Adrenaline is causing the tank to fall fast. Just like if you drove around with your foot firmly planted on the accelerator. In other words, adrenaline feels like it's a boost or a burst of energy, but the cost is at making the tank fall fast. That's how you got to go fast for a little while, because you used up petrol. So we want to learn to not live with our foot on the accelerator. So we might say anxiety and stress, too much accelerator, and not enough brake. Speaking of brakes, we're going to have one after this next section. We're nearly there. So, speaking of depleted resources, fight and flight, anger and anxiety, they are often very momentary things triggered by the event that's happening in front of us, the conversation, the thing that we're facing. But if we keep activating that sympathetic response over and over again, if we keep living with the adrenaline and suddenly depleting the tank, then suddenly we find that we don't have enough energy in the tank for something really important. Not just doing the assignment or meeting the deadline, but regulating our feelings. It takes energy to regulate your feelings. It takes energy when you know you really should be patient with your spouse, but you're feeling irritable. It takes energy to say, I'm still going to be patient. What if there's not enough in the tank to override your irritability? What if when you go to the tank to draw that energy that you would use to do the right thing, there's nothing in the tank? The tank is dry. Then the third response the freeze response becomes more and more likely. And as far as a clinical expression goes, we might call that third response depression. When suddenly there's not enough left in the tank, so that all that is left is to feel sad and empty all of the time. So, let's watch one of our most famous and beloved sons talk about his battle with depression.
Depression is, not a weakness, it's an illness, is really dear to me because I spent 5 years thinking that all this stuff that was going on in my head was my weakness, that it was me. The anxiety, the crazy thoughts, but it was the illness. It wasn't because I wasn't good enough or, because the thoughts that were in my head were actually realistic thoughts. It was the illness. I think if I had have realised that it was a illness earlier on, then I would have got treatment for it, like you should with any other illness. Like if it's an illness, the earlier you get any illness, the better you're going to be. And I know that if I had gone a bit earlier, then it wouldn't have wreaked so much havoc in my life. So that's, when I say it's an illness, it is an illness, like any other illness. The greatest thing that depression gave me was the ability to actually really discover myself and understand myself and know what I needed to do to stay well. Wellness is every day. You've got to do something for every day. We're quite happy to work for 10 or 12 hours, but do you actually look after yourself every day? Cooking is one of my passions. I'm not a great cook, but that doesn't really matter. I'm not worried about the end result sometimes. It's more about actually just understanding what I'm going to have for dinner. My advice is to go on that journey, keep trying stuff. I tried guitar for a while. Sounds like I'm killing a cat, so I don't do that anymore, but I tried, go on a journey of wellness, which is finding something that you can do every day that gives your brain that little bit of a break. I think I had an anxiety attack the other day, but it lasted about 30 seconds, not even, and I don't have any fear attached to it. So anxiety is fear, so I don't have any fear anymore. I don't fear anything. For me, I'm really well, but yes, I still get down. I know my limits. I know that if I keep pushing stuff, that I could get unwell again. Well, when you know that, you don't. You stay within, your happy boundaries, and I know those, so it's really good. If you reach out, you'll find people that have been where you're at, and they are through the other end, and they can give you heaps of advice. So, I know it's difficult. Some days I want to give up, but there's two things I sort of say. Stop fighting it, but never give up. So just relax on yourself, accept where you're at, and just look after yourself today. And when you get through today, give yourself a pat on the back. Go for the walk, even though you don't want to go for a walk. And when you get back, say, well done. So it's a real day-to-day thing. So just concentrate on being well today, and it will pass, because I'm proof.
Right, so that's JK, of course, talking about depression, and we want to be really clear that, as he is rightly pointing out, one of the causes of depression, which is very real, is what's called endogenous depression, which is that your brain is wired up in a certain way to make depression something that you will deal with. So it's not necessarily always the case of some activating event. And yet the ultimate result is the same, no matter where it comes from, and that is the more we have to cope with our feelings, the more we are seeing that tank fall, and at a certain point we can no longer regulate our feelings. Depression has a lot of symptoms, worth kind of noting here, that some of them are the more obvious ones, feeling sad, or guilty. Helpless is one that's worth underlining. Helpless and hopeless are two really big ideas that come up for people with depression. There's nothing I can do, and my future is dark. Right? So there's a real sense of powerlessness in the moment projected into the future, which means that the future will be bad too. Things like loss of interest in activities, that's a really interesting one to note. That's often a subtle symptom that people don't notice. That they just don't want to do that thing that they normally do, or that when they do it, doesn't seem as fun as it used to. It's really important. But over here on the far right-hand side, there's trouble focusing and making decisions. That's one of the big and clear depression symptoms. That once our brain is so depleted and unable to cope with regulating itself, it's very difficult for the brain to focus on a particular subject or topic or activity with any kind of sustainability. So people will often say that it feels like I try to make myself concentrate on that, but my mind just keeps going off topic. Can't really rein it in. I can't really can't sit down and say, I'm going to read the chapter of this book until it's finished. Can't really make my brain do what I want it to do anymore. So there's some symptoms. Keep in mind that those symptoms need to hang around for a reasonable amount of time for it to be depression. Sadly, of course, we will use depressed often just to mean I'm feeling a bit low today, and that's, a bad thing to feel low, but it's not necessarily depression. So in our culture, of course, we use that word depression as a bit of a catch-all, and it might be unhelpful. So we're looking for these symptoms, the majority of these symptoms, to now be present for at least 2 weeks, but in reality, it's a couple of months, and we really know for sure it's present. Because even in a couple of weeks, we can be low for a period of time and bounce back. So you'll notice the pessimism there, that's that hopelessness about the future. Interesting, isn't it, that the change in weight, remember our parasympathetic looks after eating and digestion? So when we're living over here in the sympathetic, we'll often have disruption to our eating. Our body's not good at digesting food, so we might put on weight, or we might have no appetite at all if we're in the sympathetic. So that's all worth noting, that that's how depression works. But we want to see depression through this window today, knowing that there are medical ways to see depression, and that's for another day, another time. But today we're looking at it through the lens of what happens if I'm in my sympathetic for long periods of time and the tank falls and now I can't regulate myself. Not every counsellor believes in medication, perhaps because my training was in psychology. I have more empathy for antidepressants. I think they have a real part to play, particularly understanding how they work. I really want to be clear about this because a lot of people tend to, if they have a problem with antidepressants, that's because they perceive them to be happy pills. I don't want to take a pill to make me happy. All right, question. If the pill made you happy, how come you never see someone trying to sell their antidepressants on a street corner? If they were happy pills, wouldn't we sell them recreationally? They're not happy pills. What they are, for the most part, they fall in a category called SSRI. And SSRI stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitors. I'll say it again. Selective, meaning it's focused on serotonin. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters that your brain uses to help regulate your feeling. So if you're feeling low, if something bad is happening, your brain will produce serotonin to help you control that mood, to manage that mood. It's one of the things in the tank, we might say. And depression is when that serotonin level now gets too low to help you regulate your mood. Now the reuptake bit is this, that the synapse, which is the connection between two brain neurons, where the serotonin lives, the way it normally works is that one side releases serotonin into the synapse, and then at the end it withdraws the unused serotonin to the rest of us. And that's why we don't sell them on the street corner. So one of the ways, and it's only one of the ways, I don't want to overplay this because I understand depression is a very real and medical thing for some people. But for some of us, depression is the result of having been coping for too long, and now our brain can't regulate itself anymore. We've been letting that battery deplete and deplete and deplete and deplete. Suddenly we don't know how to get back up again. My get up and go has got up and went. That's what it often feels like, isn't it? And so we want to see that there's a way of viewing these big things that many of us experience over the course of our lives, anger, anxiety, stress, and depression, as functions of life spent on the edge in this sympathetic nervous system too often, in a sympathetic dominant body, being in the wrong body. When you're in the wrong body, It's hard to have a great life. It's a tiring, anxious, angry, depressed, stressed life. We're going to take a break. But I want to prepare you that after the break, there's our final thing we're going to look at before we start looking at some solutions. But the final thing, you might need to take some deep breaths about. You won't be asked to share anything, but you might want to keep an eye on where the closest box of tissues is. Okay? So that's after the break. So, it's 11:03. We're going to make the function at a level that you used to come out much later in life, so they're being required to function in an adult world that's an overly stimulated world. So there's just so much coming at the human being now, so many messages, so much stimulation, that I suspect that the body is struggling, kind of overwhelmed, overloaded with a lot of stuff. But I also note that children, I mean, gosh, can anybody who's a certain age like mine imagine having had a phone as a kid? I mean, really? No way. I mean, the whole world is open to children in a way that you and I did not encounter. And yet their developing brains are not able to process that complicated world. So it triggers a response that says, this is too much, I can't cope with this. I'm seeing things and learning things. The Bible says, as to evil, be as a babe. Be innocent as to things of evil. And yet our children are exposed to the dark parts of humanity long before we ever heard about them. They know about stuff that they shouldn't know about. True? Anyway, that's just a thought. I'm sure there are many other complicated reasons, but that's the one that comes to mind. Yeah. Sure. Right. Good. Right. Another good image. That's right, yeah. Yeah, the medication will play a different role. It's not a magic bullet, is it? We know that we'll normally still need to explore what may be a part of that depression story, except for the person that we understand whose brain is just wired up differently. In that instance, we see them much more like the diabetic who needs to take insulin for the rest of their life. It's just that simple. Just what's there to help their brain stay wired in a way that's helpful for them. But for others of us, the medication plus some counselling plus some strategies can mean that medication can be put down at some point. Since medication only deals with symptoms, not causes. Any other thoughts before we continue? Questions? Okay. This next piece is in my journey as a counsellor, without question, the most important piece that I've bumped into in the last wee while. Without question. In fact, so much so that, I would put it, if I was only allowed to ask a few questions about a client to work out, where their issues lay, this would be one of my go-tos. If you told me, Aaron, you're only allowed to ask a couple of things, I'd say, well, I need to know their ACE score. What's the ACE score about? ACE stands for, as you can see, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And we're going to discover that for many of us, this being in the wrong body issue started a long time ago. And it started because we were in the presence of danger, trauma, abuse, neglect. And so what the research community has found is that the presence of that trauma during our most precious developing years shapes the human brain. And we're going to talk a little bit about it today to understand a little bit more about what exactly happens. The ACE score, which we're going to find out your ACE score today, by the way. You're going to get to do the questionnaire. It's only 10 questions. Some of you have done that questionnaire, I know. will cover essentially these sorts of categories. So you'll see that there is abuse. Of course, we know that abuse comes in physical, emotional, sexual ways. Neglect. Neglect is a piece that's really important. We're going to find that neglect is benign, isn't it? Because neglect is the absence of something. It's really hard to see how something not being present has hurt us. It's obvious that if I am physically assaulted, that is something that happened that hurt me. It's not as obvious that the fact that I was not loved deeply hurt as well. So we're going to really put an asterisk around that. And then there's just living in a world where stuff is now happening that is, again, too much for children to be expected to cope with. To deal with mental illness, an incarcerated relative, watching someone you love get treated badly, being in a home where drugs and alcohol are being abused and used in front of you. These are all things children are not supposed to be experiencing. Are we agreed on that? This is number one stuff, that all the stuff on that list was not supposed to happen. And yet it does so often, in so many different ways. And it turns out that the presence of this stuff in our story, in our formative years, might be one of the most important things we'll find out about why we have spent so much time in this epidemic. So let's watch this video that hopefully will explain a bit more about ACE.
My parents don't understand. All the drinking and fighting means I'm scared. I'd like a cuddle, perhaps a bedtime story, but mostly I'd like them to stop shouting at me. And sometimes they hit me. Feeling scared every day and not feeling loved or wanted will change me for the rest of my life. Later, I'll have problems at school, problems with alcohol, and I'll get in trouble with the police. What's happening to me right now means I'm more likely to have serious health problems in middle age and die sooner than I should. Doctors say my life is full of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. But in my world, this means I see my dad hitting my mum. Dad's got a drinking problem, and mum's always crying, even with the tablets. I'm always being shouted at and hit. After the booze and fags, there's not a lot of money for toys or clothes, or even food. I'm getting used to being scared all the time, now I'm just angry. Doctors say things are changing inside me. My brain isn't learning how to control my feelings properly. My body can't relax like those kids who don't have ACEs, so my body won't be able to repair itself properly when I get older, making it more likely I'll get cancer or heart disease as an adult. It hurts when my parents hit me, but the real damage is hidden, and that damage will be with me for life.
I drink and smoke. They say I'm out of control, but I'm not. It's just my way of coping with my ACEs. I've been in plenty of fights, but what's wrong with that? Kids' punches don't hurt half as much as when my dad hits me. I beat up a kid last week at school because he looked at me weird. Who cares? I ended up with more time out of school. Learning's not for me anyway, and the teachers don't care any more than my parents. I don't like the way anyone looks at me except my girl. She's 16 and pregnant, just like my mum was with me.
So this is where I've ended up. I've got diabetes and cancer's probably on the way. I know these kill you, but I could do without them. I've never had a proper job and I've spent time inside. I hate my kids I hate their mum too, until she left, so my kids have grown up with aces. And now my daughter had her first kid. She's 16. The course of my life was set in the wrong direction a long time ago. I know where I'm heading, and sadly I know where my kids are heading too. This doesn't have to happen. A little help in childhood makes a big difference to where life takes you. When I was a baby, the nurses noticed that my mum wasn't coping and helped her and explained how important my childhood is to the rest of my life. So, with a bit of help, she coped. The police came round after next door complained about the noise from mum and dad fighting. They asked how I was feeling. I told them I was scared all the time. Mum and dad got help. The shouting got better and the hitting stopped. I even got some bedtime stories. I still had problems at school, but the teacher asked me about what was happening at home. I got help controlling my feelings. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. I'm now married with 2 children, and I've got a job, most of the time. I haven't repeated the same problems with my kids. We got help when being a parent got too much. Our children are ace-free, and that means their kids stand a good chance of growing up ace-free as well. Almost half the people in England and Wales experienced 1 ace as a child, and 1 in 10 of us suffered 4 or more aces. If we stopped aces, millions of children would not become smokers or binge drinkers, and levels of violence in adults would be cut in half. Fewer aces in childhood also means fewer adults developing diseases like cancer, heart disease and diabetes in middle age. We all need to be ace aware. Are you? Doctors, police, nurses, teachers, firefighters, and most importantly, parents. The more you know about ACEs, the more you can help stop children growing up with ACEs in their lives. And for those of you who have already suffered ACEs, the more you know, the more you can help yourself and others who have suffered ACEs cope.
I like that they had a positive end to that one. Sadly, the results of having ACEs are not good. Their health outcomes, their behaviour outcomes, life potential outcomes, they all get worse the more the ACEs are. We're talking 0 to 18, your formative years. And we're going to do our ACE score in a second. I'm reminded of a man I know who lives in my neighbourhood, who helps mow our lawns, who used to be the enforcer for the Black Power. And he grew up in an adopted situation where it actually turned out his mum was, his adopted mum was his abuser. He went and told the police at age 8, he ran away and told them what was happening, and the police came back and said this to them: when you hit him, don't hit him around the head. He said at one point he would be punished by being locked in a cupboard. At one point he was in the cupboard for 3 weeks. And I asked him what was it like to be in the cupboard. He said, oh, it's my favourite place. It's the only place I knew I was safe. Nobody could hurt me. So some people's ACE score is connected to deeply painful trauma. But some of us it's connected to neglect. We might say trauma with a small t rather than trauma with a large T. So, I'm going to hand out the ACE score questionnaire. It's just 10 questions. I ask you to take one and pass it along on this side. Same again, if you can take one and pass it along. And thank you, sir. We're not going to ask you to share the results of your ACE score with anybody, so don't worry. So we're going to go through the questionnaire together, or at least read the questions together, and I simply want you to tick by each of them. You don't actually have to mark the paper if you're afraid that somebody will see what you ticked. You can keep score in your head. But we're going to go through each of the 10 questions, and keep a score out of 10 at the end, right? So you'll get a score from 0 to 10 as a result of it. Has everybody got the question in yet? Ellie, are you there? So we're thinking only of the first 18 years of life. Bad things happen in adult life, but they're not the things we're worried about when we look at the ACE score. We're interested in the first 18 years. The formative years, while our brain is still developing, while we are little and others are big. That's an important point. We are little, things are happening to us, we are not happening to them. Big people are making choices about the way life will be for us. Okay, so let's go through it, and then we'll talk about what your score might mean. So when you were growing up, during the first 18 years of life, number 1, did a parent or other adults in the household often, in the key word often, swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? So if the answer is yes to any of that, you can think that's 1. Okay, that's a yes. They often do any of those things. Number 2, did a parent or other adult in the household often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you? Or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Again, if you can say yes to any of that being often, give yourself a yes. Number 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touched their body in a sexual way, or try to have oral, anal, or vaginal sex? So that's a very adult question. Number 4, did you often feel that no one in your family loved you, or thought you were important or special, or that your family didn't really look out for each other, feel very close to each other, or support each other? Then give yourself a yes if the answer is yes. Did you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, or had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you, or that parents were so drunk or high that they couldn't take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? Number 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? Number 7, was your mother or stepmother often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at you, or sometimes, or often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes, or threatened with a gun, or a knife, or something else of that kind? Number 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker, an alcoholic, or used street drugs? Number 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member ever attempt suicide? And number 10, did anyone in the household ever go to prison? Okay, just signal to me that you have your ACE score in your mind. You know what your ACE score is now. Signal to me, yep. So what does your ACE score mean? Well, your ACE score is going to tell us about this. It's going to tell us about a thing called toxic stress. Stress in itself, as we've talked about, isn't necessarily a bad thing in terms of positive stress, like being required to do something that takes a bit of attention, or even tolerable stress. I'm feeling that something's difficult, but at least I'm being supported. It's this bottom, you can barely see the word toxic there, toxic stress. So let's acknowledge the nature of toxic stress. It's the prolonged activation of the stress response system in the absence of protective relationships. Or to put in layman's terms, in childhood I felt afraid a lot of the time, but there was no one to help me with that. I felt afraid a lot of the time, but there was nobody to help me with that. So it's the presence of stress that keeps appearing and appearing and appearing, but nobody comes, nobody helps me, nobody supports me. I don't get the strength of the big people to help me with what's happening. I have to face it alone. Because that's the double whammy, isn't it? A bad thing is happening, that's bad, and I'm little. and nobody's here to help me, and I don't know what to do. That's the second bad thing. It's what I call the secondary trauma. It's facing the bad thing alone. So your ACE score tells us how often toxic stress was present in your life. The higher your score, the more toxic stress. Now, what's the impact of toxic stress? Well, literally, your brain gets poisoned by the presence of adrenaline and cortisol. Constantly setting off this alarm, constantly being in this sympathetic body, constantly flooded with adrenaline to cope with just everyday life in this family, in this life, in this house. And I want you to hear this key thing that we now know is different about children with a high ACE score. The part of your brain that works out if this present moment is dangerous is underdeveloped if you have a high ACE score. For a very logical reason. If it's always dangerous, I don't need to work out if the present moment is dangerous, because the answer is always yes. So people with a high ACE score often struggle working out if the present moment is dangerous because that part of their brain is not as highly developed. Or to put it this way, their brain is better at assuming danger than assessing danger. It assumes it's dangerous. It's not very good at working out if it really, truly is. All right, so what is your ACE score? Like I said, I'm not going to ask you to tell anyone. But I will ask you this question. Where do you imagine your ACE score places you in a general population? Do you think your ACE score is high and that not many people experience the kind of trauma that you did? Or do you expect that your score is kind of typical, that most people probably had the level of trauma that your score represents? Or do you imagine that actually you were very low and therefore being protected from trauma? Let's take a look at where it actually places you, because you might be shocked. So here's the distribution of ACEs, and I should point out, by the way, if you're wondering, is this kind of locked in a cultural phenomenon? This research has been done across cultural, racial groupings. So I spoke to a man recently who had an ACE score based on his own childhood experiences, but then, in the next breath, told me, oh yeah, but there were gangs living right beside of us, and kids from the gangs would hide at our house, and drunken gang members would come and beat down the house trying to find their kids. And that's pretty flippin' scary. Technically, you're right, that we wouldn't have found it on the list, so yeah. So this is not exhaustive, but so yes. So where does the ACE score place you, though? This is really important to understand as to whether or not your brain is a highly traumatized brain or not. And here's the answer. If you have an ACE score of 3 or more, you are in the top 21% most traumatized people. I want to just stop and let that sink in for a second. If you have a score of 3 or more, you are in the top 21 most traumatized people out of any 100 from our culture. In other words, most people did not have to learn to deal with the abuse and neglect that you had to learn to deal with. Most people never had to. So I'll tell you my family score so you can get a sense. My score is 3, so I'm with you. You're feeling like, holy moly, I'm in that top group. You're freaking kidding me. Yeah, well, I'm there with you. Mentally ill mum, parents threatening to separate all the time, unsure about where I stood with my parents in terms of being loved and supported. Dad was a problem drinker. I could probably give myself a 4 if I really pushed it. I shouldn't keep reading that jolly questionnaire. My wife's score is 0. My stepchildren, their score is 2. My daughter's score is 1. So just to give you a sense that even in the same family, you can have very different scores. But if your score is 3 or more, then it is worth noting that there's a very good chance that your brain, as you were growing, really struggled to deal with the presence of fear and therefore adrenaline. That your body was in the sympathetic state a lot of the time. When I asked this man about life now, he was commenting about how he was still struggling with anger as an adult. But then when I told him the ACE score, this is what he said: "Is that why I jump whenever I hear a slammed door?" Yes. His ACE score remembered angry men looking for children, slamming doors, parents fighting, slamming doors. But his traumatized brain still remembers. And the alarm goes on. What's happening again? Your ACE score is a really important piece of information about you. And if you work with others, having a sense of their ACE score, I mean, you might not give them a questionnaire, but as you listen to their story, you start to piece it together. You know, I pieced it together when I heard just a comment of, oh, your mum was a solo mum, but she did pretty well, but we went out without a lot. Oh, so I just heard 2 of them mentioned. I know your parents are separated now, and I know that you didn't have enough. So immediately my brain is like, well, we should let me talk to you about something. Because if your body has been constantly exposed to adrenaline and in this sympathetic state, then it's going to be a real thing to deal with in adult life. And I'm fascinated that when I talk to people whose ACE score is high, and I ask them about this parasympathetic body, this relaxed body, the body that can repair itself and heal, the body that feels safe. And so often they'll say to me, I can't even remember the last time I felt like that. They'll say things like, I go on holiday and I still don't get relaxed. I never really truly relax. I don't even know how to relax. True? Anybody else hear him? Yeah. So that's why this stuff is so important. So, there's all the problems. Time for some solutions. We now realise that many of us, for one reason or another, are living on the edge because we keep living in the wrong body. And now it's time to learn to push back against the dominoes. It's time to push back against that which seems so powerful, so automated, so out of my control. Can I do something about it? And the good news is that I can. Everything in mental health, by and large, starts with this: self-awareness. Who's feeling a little bit more self-aware already now that we've covered these 5 topics? Right? I didn't know it was a problem until I heard the stuff, but now I've heard the stuff and I realise that's me. Right? So self-awareness is already the beginning of healing. It's already started. Because you can't fix what you can't name. You can't help what you can't identify. So now even just having some language means you've already begun the journey towards health, because now at least we know what the issue is called. And we know that the issue isn't you, it's this problem of this body. It's interesting, isn't it? For many of us, this year has been a bit like a traumatic childhood, hasn't it? Because even lockdown put our bodies in the sympathetic for many of us. We felt trapped in our homes, unable to move. And suddenly we got into the sympathetic body. That's why you've heard so many people say things like, during lockdown, your 3 choices were to become a hunk, a chunk, or a drunk. I went for hunk, thank you. I lost 7 kilos during lockdown. Yeah, I really did go for hunk. And now I don't feel so good about it that I heard your laughter. But. So what in particular, though, do we need to be self-aware about? And it's this. You probably can't read this very well, can you? Not very easy to read. By the way, if you contact the centre here, Joe can send you this PowerPoint. So if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, it's all yours. So I'm going to read a few of them for you just so we can get a sense of them. So particularly thinking around anxiety and anger, about what triggers us. So let's read a few of them, and then I'm going to ask you to share with the person next to you what you kind of maybe already suspect might be a trigger for you, as a little self-awareness exercise. So conflict or drama in my family, friendships or relationships, being in a large crowd of people, meeting someone new or going somewhere I haven't been before, having to confront or approach someone. Any conflict-averse people in the house? Yeah, come on. Trying to make other people happy, having too much to get done, making plans, being away from my parent or family members, performing or presenting, any sudden change, having too much time to think, not knowing what will happen in the future. Oh, that's my one. Grades or stress from schoolwork, being away from home, family and loved ones, when I or my loved ones travel, going anywhere or doing certain things by myself, loud noises, raised voices, being around certain people, being in tight spaces or maybe wide open spaces, negative thinking, getting criticised, having conversations, being unprepared. And then in anger we had things like when an adult or somebody yells at me or scolds me, when I get a bad grade, when I get in trouble for something I didn't do, or when my parents or boss makes a big deal out of nothing, someone breaks a promise, my friends talk about me, other people talk about me behind my back, people touch my things without permission, people go into my room, or I lose at sport or something, people are arguing, I'm feeling disrespected, other people are making decisions for me, or I'm left out, or my electronics stop working. Hello? The computer has heard the majority of my swear words. People invade my personal space. People talk to me like I'm a kid or an idiot. Or I'm bullied or picked on. People steal from me. Or I don't feel listened to or understood. When I'm not good enough at something. When I'm not invited to the event. When I get injured. And so on and so on. So, chance to talk to the person next to you, demonstrate some self-awareness, and tell them about one thing that you notice is a bit of a trigger for you. That it's very hard to suppress that sympathetic response when that happens. You find that's really challenging to deal with. What would be an example of a trigger? Share. All right, so I know for me, one of my big triggers will be being criticised. And I can tell you the little backstory just because I come to understand it. I discovered somewhere in maybe the early teen years that I had a muscly brain. Not a particularly muscly body, but a muscly brain. And it was the presence of girls that really helped, because it was in a boys only intermediate, and then girls appeared in Form 3. That's a whole line in Form 3. And suddenly I went from being a straight C and B student to being a straight A student. The girls did not seem as impressed by my muscly brain, for the record. But nonetheless, I began to build a lot of my sense of worth and value around the fact that I could get good grades, and it turned out I was smart, and that was a new thing to learn. And so anytime I was criticised, it kind of felt like, oh, well, you're saying that I'm not smart, and maybe that means you don't want me. And so there was quite a little bit of a story behind that trigger. But to this day, I find criticism something painful, and particularly a form of criticism that seems misplaced. So as a subset of that, for me, a big trigger would be not being seen for who I really am. So for example, I was sitting in a leadership meeting one time, and the other members of the team said, "Your emails are a bit abrupt. You don't even say hello, how are you doing, hope you're well. You just convey information, and that's abrupt." At the end of the meeting, my wife, having seen this one coming a mile off, just grabbed me and said, "It's very painful when people don't see you for who you really are, eh? You're not abrupt, you're just trying to be efficient." So she helped soften that really quickly for me, because she could sense like, abrupt, you say. I don't like for people not realising who I really am and thinking something bad about me that I don't feel is really true. So there you go, there's one of my triggers. Anybody else like to share a trigger that they identified? Yeah, so self-awareness is going to be the starting point of our journey. When we're aware that the trigger, and that's why I told you my story, that my trigger doesn't belong to the person criticising me. It belongs to another person at another time. Right? So when I'm self-aware, it helps me distinguish between what's happening in this moment and when my brain is reaching it back into another moment and getting confused. That's why self-awareness is helpful. And it means that I know as soon as I hear criticism, I need to go into not self-protection, but self-soothing, comfort, nurture. I need to be there for myself, reminding myself, we don't like being criticised. You get confused. Yeah.
A lot of the things on the anger chart there, I don't encounter in day-to-day life, but
Sure.
I imagine that if I did, I would be angry.
Right. Well, just as well.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that an interesting comment? Because we might say that some of us, not saying you do, but for some of us, we might have actually arranged our life to avoid our triggers. Which is not an entirely bad thing to do, it's an understandable thing to do, but it might not be as helpful because we can't actually keep life the way we need it to be 100% of the time. So, that's why we want to talk about self-regulation, not self-control. Self-control is this kind of gritting of my teeth. I'm going to get through this. I'm going to not get upset this time. I'm going to be good. Right? Self-regulation says I might be about to get into the wrong body, or I might be there already. I need to help support that mood, support that experience. A few years ago, finally got to go to Disneyland. Took my wife and then 12-year-old daughter. She turned 13 on the trip. That was annoying because halfway through the trip we started to have to pay adult fare for things. And the thing was, I had told her that I'd lost respect for my parents, that when I went on a 12-year-old trip and turned 13 during the trip, that my parents lied to the tour operators to get the child thing, and I'd lost respect for my parents. And then I told my daughter, I'd lost respect for my parents, so I will pay full price. Not happily. I was glad that some of the tour operators were like, she's only been 13 a week, let's forget it. Anyway, side. We were both at Disneyland. We had met a young couple who were on their honeymoon, and they had had a big night the night before, and they were jet lagged, and they shared a taxi ride from the hotel down to Disneyland. And then this young husband turns to his wife and he said something I just thought was so interesting. He said, observing his tiredness, his hungover-ness, oh, this is entirely the wrong mood for Disneyland. What an interesting comment. He'd observed that this mood doesn't belong here. But what I never got a chance to do was to go up to him and say, but do you know what to do about it? Can you in fact regulate that mood? I think he did, because by the time we saw them later in the day, they were having a whale of a time. And he was in the right mood for Disneyland. Self-regulation is about whether or not I can get back into the right mood. Rather than play with the mood that's come. Rather than enter further into this sympathetic response. And hopefully today we're going to learn a little bit before we go about the fact that your mood is listening to what you are saying. Your mood is listening to how you are treating yourself. That you can in fact regulate. You don't have to just go with it. Just because the emotion comes knocking doesn't mean you have to open the door and let it in. So what are we going to do to help regulate? Well, there's something we can do with our thoughts. We can recast some of our thoughts. We can listen to our thoughts and ask myself this question: is there a less painful way of seeing what I'm seeing? So when I'm feeling that this is too much, I could ask myself, well, what do I need? Or when I think, gosh, I'm so behind, instead of focusing on the bit that I haven't done, I could turn my attention to, but what can I celebrate? What's going well? Right? Can you hear how I'm trying to relax my body? I'm not trying to pump up the bit that's a threat, the bit I haven't done. I'm trying to pump up the bit that's safe, the bit I have done. Why? Because I'm going to need this problem-solving part of my brain to get the other stuff done. I messed up. What do I learn? This isn't working. What small tweak can I try? This is some examples of ways of recasting thoughts. In 2018, I came back from a failed experiment in a new life in Australia. And so I spent 320 days unemployed, as I had to start my counselling business from scratch again. And I applied for 150 jobs. I don't recommend applying for that many. And then I would get close to some of those jobs. I'd be, final 2, even final 1. It was me versus thin air, and thin air won. That was painful. And I had to learn to recast. Because it was tempting to believe what my brain was saying when I missed out. You're never going to get a job. Nobody wants you. You've stuffed it all up. You've ruined your life. It's all going to be bad from here on out. Right? But instead I let her remind myself, no, they were only deciding if I was the person who was the best fit for that job. That's the only thing that's being assessed. And I wasn't the best fit. And that's still painful. Well, not fun to not be the best fit. I wanted to be the best fit. But it's way less painful than you're a loser who's never going to work again. One keeps me in my sympathetic feeling that life itself has become a threat to me. That job applications have become a threat to me. The other keeps me relaxed and able to get back up again and apply for more jobs tomorrow. Because if I'm not the best fit, well, maybe I will be for the next one. So I can keep going now. I can stay in my parasympathetic. This is for Rose. Never in the history of calming down has anyone ever calmed down by being told to calm down. Right? Okay. So self-regulation reminds me that it's my feelings, so I will need to take responsibility for my feelings. But other people can help me. Okay? But this isn't the way they help me. What's the problem? What's the unspoken message behind being told to calm down? You're being irrational? You're upsetting me? I don't know what to do with you.
Not understanding the other person.
Yeah, I don't really get where you're coming from. I don't know what you're having all these feelings for. I don't really care. Yeah. Isn't that funny? Calm down sounds like it should be a caring thing to say, but it doesn't communicate care, does it? It communicates assessment. I've assessed your feeling and I found you to be overreacting. Dial it down, would you? Yeah. Oh, good. So now I'm overreacting and I'm an idiot. Thank you. Right? So we've heaped a new problem onto the person. They're not sure that I care. I certainly don't feel understood. So that's not how others can help us. This is what's needed. Empathy. Not calming down, but empathy. Empathy is the key. But empathy isn't what we feel like doing in that moment. And why is that? Well, it's this little thing called limbic attunement. Us counsellor types love limbic attunement because limbic attunement is a bit like this in a counselling session. People will sit down and say, I just feel so calm in your office. I just feel so relaxed talking to you. Have you ever had someone say, can I stay here? No. they saying it? And it's simply this, that their limbic system is listening to mine. You see, our limbic systems can hear each other. You know that because you walked into a room where people had been fighting before you walked into the room, but have stopped, and yet, when you walked in, you were like, there's tension in this room. There's something wrong. Your brain could hear their brain. So empathy, we could say it a bit like this. Empathy is the opportunity for deciding which thing will be contagious, their fear or your calm. Because our brains are listening to each other. Well, of course, if the person is triggered and they start talking with a really angry voice, and your brain hears their angry voice, goes, ah! And suddenly, instead of there being one afraid person, now there's two afraid people. Right? You caught their afraid. What we might call the dance. These are the steps of the dance. I know something you like. You perceive that as a threat and ramp up. I hear that you've ramped up, and I get afraid and I ramp up. We all know how this dance works. Nobody's having a good time. So empathy is about committing to your calm being contagious. But you'll note that it's empathy before education. So it's not, well, this is your problem. Here's a phrase to avoid. What you need to do. Now what you need to do is, that's what you need to do. Again, remembering that education, like calm down, communicates this unspoken message that your feeling is wrong, that there's something wrong with the way you're responding. Let me tell you how you should be feeling, what you should be thinking. So this is what I perceive of empathy. Too often in life, when we encounter someone in the pit of a deep, dark feeling, we'll stand at the edge of the pit and say, what are you doing down there? I don't know how you got down there, but hold on, I've got a rope. Climb up. That's education. Sounds like it's a good thing to do, right? Sounds like that's nice. Throwing down a brother, give me a way to get out. But this is what empathy looks like. Oh my goodness! You're in a dark pit. Hold on, I've got a rope. I'm coming down. It's climbing down into the pit and sitting with the person and waiting for them to catch your calm, your strength, your love. And then as their body begins to calm down, the problem-solving, creative, rational part of their brain returns, and then you will hear them offer themselves some empathy. So it might sound like something like this. They might, when you're in, what's going on? Nobody loves me. That's terrible. I'm coming down. Tell me about that. Yeah, nobody loves me. Nobody cares about me. Oh, that's awful. It's awful to feel that way. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying you're right. I'm just saying it's awful to feel that way. Agree? Empathy doesn't mean I agree. It just means I agree that that feeling stinks. And when they get that empathy for a little while, hopefully you'll hear them say something like this. Well, maybe it's not quite that bad. I mean, obviously you care, but I know my mum really loves me. And they start to give themselves some empathy. They start to move from needing your strength to offering strength to themselves. Empathy is the support that we offer others. In counselling lingo, we call this holding space. We don't insist that the other person has to go anywhere, move anything, fix anything yet. We're just here in this space with them. But we're turning this space from a scary space into a safe space because we are safe. Right? And then maybe you'll get to offer some education. And when, friends, when is the time that you get to offer your great insight? When they ask for it. What do you think I should do? Do you think that that's what happened? And let me even give you the softer version, because this is one I've had to learn because I love being right. I will try and preface what I know to be right with these words. I can't help but wonder. Certain people who get conversations with me seem to be nodding. That's not nice. I want to give you a really important tool here for helping soothe yourself. It's great to have friends and family who love us, who support us, but we don't have access to them all the time. But we have to have access to ourselves all the time. So I'm going to hand out another handout for you. And this one is a list of options, tactics, ideas. Oh, do the pass around, thank you. Pass around. Oh, thanks for your Right. Well, this is coming around. Maybe give enough of those. The other way as well. Okay. So I'm hoping what you've understood today, I'm a counsellor. I love cracking the case. Oh, do I like cracking the case? It's my favourite bit. You know, those of you who talk to me will have heard me say things like, well, that's just a theory. I mean, anything about that kind of sound like that could be the case? There's none of the business is. You know, that's exactly it. And yet, for all that I love the case and cracking the case, this stuff is more important than that stuff. Because if I can get back into the parasympathetic, I don't need to crack the case as often. Because sometimes, have you noticed in life, when you're finally back being relaxed and comfortable in your own body again, that thing that you thought was such a big problem, you don't even care about anymore. You don't even have a great concern about cracking that case anymore. You just don't care. So, truthfully, I'd love to do myself out of a job by teaching people to get back into the right body and staying there. Thank you. So let's have a quick look at them. So you'll notice that this list is not exhaustive, but it's pretty good. Is a list of things to do to regulate your body. Because remember, before we worry about cracking the case, we have to make sure we're in the right body. So I can put it this way. This is a list of things that you can do to get back into the right body by using the various senses of your body. Yeah? And so depending on what kind of person you are, you'll appeal to certain areas more than others. So you'll notice with movement there, for example, for me, walking wouldn't do it, because man can I have an angry walk. Anybody else like the angry walk? Just me? I like a good angry walk. So walking doesn't really work for me. I noticed that my mum is a rocker. You live with someone who rocks. As a child, I used to think there was something wrong with her. She was sitting on the phone, talking to someone, the whole time doing this. What is wrong with you, lady? But somewhere in childhood, rocking is comforting. And so it's a way of comforting yourself. So you're going to find the thing that works for you. Touch and temperature. So for me, my absolute go-to is there under petting a dog. I'm not a cat person. Dogs are best. End of argument. I have 2 Cavalier King Charles Spaniels in case one of them is busy. But preferably 2 hands, 2 dogs. That's the way life should work. And I will use the Cavaliers to comfort my body. The sense of the warmth of the dog, the snuggle of the dog, the smell of the dog. I seem to have taught my dogs to talk back while they're getting patted too, which is kind of fun. I'm just thinking of the being hugged or held. All right, I want to teach you something. You going to volunteer? This is funny because I've known Rose for a long time, and one of the things that she liked about when we were in the same church together was that there was an occasion where a group of us met up, and as Christians do love to do, they like to hug each other, because, I mean, how else are you going to get coronavirus? But Rose didn't know me very well, and at least I was smart enough in that moment to realise that maybe the hug wasn't something she was into, so I respectfully waved or did something, and she appreciated it. I laughed because I'm about to teach you the thing called the boring hug. The hug is very important. Remember our ACE score? It's the bad things that happened, but nobody was there to comfort me. I was alone. So alone is the hardest part of feeling upset. And the boring hug is a way of us learning to comfort other people, but without having it to mean anything. There doesn't have to be any affection in the hug, any in particular. It is literally a boring hug. So, here we go. Welcome to the boring hug. Just the boring hug. There's nothing in it. There's no, thank you, Rose. There's no emotion in the boring hug. Yeah? Go on.
The first time Aaron asked me, do you want a hug? I actually ran through my list of triggers, and I thought, well, I've known him for a little while now, and he's not that scary. And I didn't realise that my mouth said this out loud. It said, yeah, I think I can do that.
So, we had talked, Margaret talked about the weighted blanket. So what's a weighted blanket? You may have seen one. It's how you give yourself a hug. So the boring hug is a really good option when you're around somebody else and you notice that they're feeling triggered. Just give them a boring hug. Just literally just put your arms around them. They can feel the contact of another human being, the warmth of your body, the fact that your heart rate is normal. If you're married, by the way, extra benefit, did you know that married people regulate each other's heart rate and blood pressure? Did you know that? That's actually what happens. That's how connected human beings get. Anyway, I digress. What if you don't have someone to hug you? A weighted blanket is a great way to get a hug. So a weighted blanket, if you've never seen one, is a blanket with weights in the lining of it, and you use it when you're lying in bed to create the sensation of being held. Remembering that really, at its most simple, getting back into your parasympathetic is simply this. Doing things that you would never do if there really was danger present. Because as soon as your body notices you're doing things you would never do if you were really in danger, it starts to conclude, maybe we are in danger. So the weighted blanket's beautiful. You can get them on Trade Me, but my daughter recommends that you get a heavier one than you think you're going to like. Because she says, heavier the better. Good workout making the beds with the weighted blankets. Nice. Nice. All right, so for those of us who are auditory, we might enjoy listening just to the sound of a fan. I'm a pluviophile, which means I thoroughly enjoy the sound of rain on the roof. As long as I'm in a nice, safe, warm room. Although at 1:30 this morning, I was not feeling safe with the thunder and thinking, will I be okay? Now, I found one here on this list only recently. All my childhood, I was a singer, I was in choirs, I was in shows. But recently, I discovered that YouTube has a rather exhaustive list of karaoke tracks. And I discovered that a jolly good sing gets me in my parasympathetic.